Okay, why don't we get started? See a few new faces, so welcome to City Forum, which is the CRP program colloquium. Normally at City Forum we have scholars or professionals or community people from outside. And we actually have a tremendous amount of research prowess and technical expertise among our students. And so we wanted to try this year to have some student presentations. And we have a great fortune to have Ben Martin today to talk about artistic and cultural activity and its relationship to planning issues. You can obviously think of some, clear connections, everything from noise ordinances to spaces for artistic and cultural activity, festival planning, supporting artistic and cultural workers, gentrification issues associated with the arts, and so on and so forth. And this kind of set of issues has kind of moved, I would say, a little bit more into the middle of planning practice, and it so it confronts planners in various positions in the public, nonprofit, and even private consulting sector. Ben has been a professional activist in this area prior to coming to CRP, and then while he's been in the program, he's worked for some sort of leading national art and cultural consulting organizations, one here in Austin and one, I guess it's now in Pennsylvania,
Yes.
Arts.
Yeah.
So he has really a lot of expertise, a lot of really interesting insights in this area. So welcome, Ben.
All right. Okay, hey, as Dr. Oden said, I'm Ben Martin. I am a student here in the Community and Regional Planning Master's Program last semester, fingers crossed. Also, as Michael said, I am currently working for Go Collaborative, which is a cultural planning consultancy here in Austin. Prior to that, worked for Metris Arts Consulting, another cultural planning consultancy. It was kind of funny as I was listening to your intro, some of the intersections that you outlined at the intersection of culture, art, and planning topics and activities were ones that I feel like this is like a jam-packed presentation, and you named like 7 things that I wasn't able to include in here. So this is like for a couple of reasons, this is like 2 steps down the trail of a few major themes in cultural planning and creative placemaking. This isn't like a catch-all for everything going on at this intersection, but it's like maybe a starting point. And also, I've been only really truly active for like max 2 years in this discipline, so I'm by no means like a lifelong expert and can provide that level of wisdom. But I have a lot of opinions, and I am building up experience, and so this is sort of the state of where I'm at right now with this topic. So a little background on me, that's me, and those are the places that I'm affiliated with. So before I came back to planning school, I worked as a creative arts and cultural freelancer, and I did like anything you can think of, I've probably done it. I've done event production, I've composed film scores, I've video edited, I've worked for other organizations, I've produced work for myself. I made some, the best money in that field, which is still not great, is working for like big productions, like this is a Hype Hotel at South by Southwest. I was on the production team here. And I used work like that to kind of subsidize myself doing my own work that was a little more community level. And then at one point, we decided to convert an old school bus to run off of waste vegetable oil and toured it around the West Coast. It was a lot of fun, but we kind of screwed up the cost-benefit analysis on that one and lost a lot of money, but it was a worthwhile learning experience, I guess. And then I landed back here, and as much as I maybe tried half-heartedly, I couldn't really kick the arts and culture bug, and I was always looking for avenues to find that overlap of where that fits into planning practice. And so, yeah, the sort of way that I have this mapped out for today is that I'm going to talk about some major themes or some major intersections that I see between arts and culture and planning. Just sort of give kind of a primer to where the conversation seems to be at right now, and then sort of end on some areas where art and culture is in the mix on some really tense, kind of like fiery issues in communities right now. So, what is cultural planning? Cultural planning is making cultural plans, and that's my lecture. Everybody have a great afternoon. So yeah, no, I mean, like, technically that's what it is like a city department, like the Cultural Arts Division, will develop a cultural economic development, community development vision for Austin and make that plan. But what goes into that conversation, that's what we're going to talk about today. So some guideposts as we go forward. In some ways, I just want to highlight this for the folks who are planners in the room. We tend to be very public sector focused, very, I don't know, often like quant or spatial focused, and the boundaries get really fuzzy in cultural planning and creative placemaking. There's a lot of players. Sometimes the public sector isn't even the central player, and sometimes you sort of don't even realize it, but you've kind of moved out of the built environment entirely, and you sort of have to reflect on, like, is this still related to planning at all or not? Like, the slippage is kind of all over the place, and some of the centers of gravity are not really in planning at all. Some of it is in community development and social work, but there is a lot of these overlapping spheres and players. And it's also fuzzy in the sense that there are again, many players, many things you can do that count as arts and cultural planning or creative placemaking, and many outputs, many goals that you're attempting to achieve. And so it feels maybe counterintuitive at first that you're looking at one activity or exercise or strategy that you expect to have a discrete goal, and then you sort of get to the end of it, and it actually has like this strange smattering of goals that are hitting on a bunch of different levels. So we'll start with kind of the easy one that everybody is fairly familiar with, public art. We've got a lot of this in Austin, Second and Brazos here, and then down at the Seaholm development, the public table. So we're talking about murals, we're talking about interactive pieces like this that sort of better the community in some way, make it the increased quality of life or increased sense of place. I'm going to hone in. We did, with Go Collaborative, I did a bunch of work in the fall for Cap Metro on visioning what they're, and strategizing how to expand their art and transit program. And so a lot of the research that I did for that, sort of scoping what that best practices in art and transit were around the country, feels like a good way to talk through why public art. So this is a project Cap Metro worked on last summer. Here's done on South Congress. I can't remember where this one is. But they contracted artists to paint utility boxes at bus stops along the Metro Rapid line. So this is a pretty basic foundational type of public art project. It just makes a bus stop a place. Really, I think a lot of the gain that Cap Metro got out of this is they want to try more ambitious projects in the future, and this was their first step towards building internal capacity, how to contract with artists, what problems and snags you run into when you're actually putting these boxes out in public. And what maintenance is like. Maintenance is really expensive for projects like this. Cities that are further along, this is Charlottesville. They have design integrated public art. So each new bus shelter that goes in has a sort of community responsive or community integrated or reflective art piece that's integrated into the glass design in the bus shelters. And they go really big. This is a park and ride, and they integrated this like art design into the development of the park and ride itself. They have what's called a percent for art in capital projects, that they actually scope their capital projects work with 1% of the entire budget set aside for arts projects, and they integrate their artist into the design team at the earliest stages of their capital projects. Other cities like Atlanta actually take it a little different. They don't go with this monumental scale permanent thing. They're a little more tactical and sort of about activation and community building. So they have a really robust station performance series in the Atlanta subway system. And then in terms of what public art projects can do, yeah, they make a place a place. They make it maybe look more beautiful or be more activated or exciting. But they can also have a more specific purpose than that. So this is back in Austin. This is another Cap Metro project. That's Randy Clark, the CEO of Cap Metro right now. And what they did is they were working in the 12th and Chacon neighborhood, historically African-American neighborhood, to sort of show, this was like kind of a goodwill effort by Cap Metro to say that we want to support and uplift your community, that your community is important to us, and we want to work with you to make the bus stop right at this intersection a place for you. And so through over a year of community outreach, forums, charrettes, conversations, they gathered together photographs and oral histories from the neighborhood, sort of letting the neighborhood explain their own history to Cap Metro and putting it together with them. So they use the expertise of an artist to help facilitate the community assembling their own story, and then installed this also over the summer 2018. And so we understood that what we were asking of Cap Metro is that ultimately they would need to put more money on the table if they wanted to do more projects like this. And so we were really concerned about what kind of outcomes we were going to give them, especially for a transit agency. This is not an economic development department or something that's more traditionally has an arts element to it. And so there could be a lot of angry people if for no good reason Cap Metro just starts dumping a bunch of money into art and, you know, not more buses or more reliable buses. And so we were focusing on all of these sort of like hard things like safety, graffiti abatement, increases in ridership, and even secondary like advancing the creative economy, supporting artists, which would be important for Austin broadly. And when we took that to meetings with them, what we got back was these projects appealed to them because they wanted Cap Metro's system to be a delight for people who use it. They weren't interested in graffiti abatement. They were really into the relational placemaking, community building, and relationship building aspects that this could bring. And what we ended with is this is going to be, if you ever work with Cap Metro right now, the value of transit, expressing the value of transit to Central Texans is like their big buzz phrase. And so that's kind of like a magic word. If you ever need to try to convince Cap Metro people of something, just say it it expresses the value of transit. They'll like really go for it. But you know, really meaningfully, they want these projects to show that Cap Metro is not a separate entity from the community, that it's a meaningful contributor to the community and with the community, and that these projects actually can do what, you know, your normal public meeting can't do, which is develop these dense networks of relationships that aren't just like a one-time thing, but are like true relationships that make this not just kind of a monolithic agency on the side, but actually something that you have an access point to. So I'm not going to spend too much time on arts economy. This is kind of where you get into that like Richard Florida controversy. Do firms attract creative class people and high education, high income, high skill folks, or is it the other way around? Suffice to say that communities over the last couple of decades do use some variations on this strategy. And just like really lightly, I want to touch on one community, Easton, Pennsylvania, where I lived over the summer. This town is kind of a real dinky little place. It's like less than 30,000 people. They have a really high vacancy rate. They were a silk mill town in the 19th century, and they kind of struggled to transition into the 20th century, let alone the 21st. And so they are, for the last decade, they are all in on using art to attract people back to this community. So they have an arts trail that's really beautiful. They have an insurgent, non-city run, just like private people coming together and fundraising for a mural program. They have a really high per capita gallery scene. They have the oldest continuously running farmers market in the U.S., and it's packed like this every weekend. They have music programming here and arts activities in theming integrated into each week of this farmers market. They even have a New Orleans-style brass band that's all volunteer in their West Ward neighborhood. They would march past my window about once a week when I lived up there, and that's my landlady Jen right there on the snare drum, looking confused. So whether or not they succeed in filling these vacant residences and revitalizing this town, they're doing that same thing. They're developing those dense networks and relationships. What Easton is doing a really good job with is they're providing these avenues for entry, or they're reducing barriers to entry for participation and for participating in these activities for every single person who lives in this community. And it's small enough that it really is like a person-to-person relationship skill. And they're just like piece by piece trying to bring every single person who lives in this community into it. And they may succeed for kind of some funny, very specific reasons that wouldn't translate well to other places, but they are a straight shot on 78 from New York and Newark. And so as those markets stay red hot, the idea of sort of selling Easton as a commuter town becomes more and more enticing, and so amping that up with a robust creative sector and a lot of arts and cultural activities may actually work for them. The other part of that is that they're right over the Delaware from New Jersey. They're the first town right over the border, right on the river, and just hopping that river, your property taxes fall 2/3. And so the extra, however many miles that you don't buy a house here, but you instead go there, all of a sudden the math starts adding up. So who knows, maybe Easton pulls this off. I don't know if that'll attract firms here, but they may be able to be a little bedroom community. So what I was doing in Easton this is kind of the big main thing, right? Like, this is the main attraction, creative placemaking. If you're at all interested in this intersection of civics and planning and arts and culture, creative placemaking is the conversation right now. And there is plenty of controversy in it and plenty of diverse opinions about its effectiveness or what it's even trying to do, or whether or not we're even on the same page of about what we're talking about with creative placemaking, but this is the conversation to be a part of right now. And so I went to Easton to work with this woman, Anne Godwin Nicodemus, who is sort of a luminary in the creative placemaking world. Her big claim to fame is that she is the co-author of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Placemaking White Paper that came out at the beginning of the 2010s. She co-authored it with another Anne, Anne Markison, who has a long history with Dr. Oden here. I've never actually met Anne Markison, so if you want to know more about her, Oden's your guy. And this is their creative placemaking report. This was sort of like the congealing moment or ground zero where creative placemaking really has taken off in the last decade. And this is sort of the report that all of these conversations, the critical mass occurred here, and then everything moved out from that. So this is kind of a boring slide, but I think it's a really important slide. So this is the definition from this NEA white paper of what creative placemaking is. And I'm going to belabor it and just read the entire thing because I think it's important and a little odd. In creative placemaking, partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, city, or region around arts and cultural activities. Creative placemaking animates public and private spaces, rejuvenates structures and streetscapes, improves local business viability and public safety, and brings diverse people together to celebrate, inspire, and be inspired. And when I read that, I think, like, that's just like anything. Like, there's literally no there. Like, so what are you saying here? You're saying, like, anyone can do it. You can do it to shape physical space or not, like social space too, okay? You can do it at any scale, Arts and cultural activities, that's the one constant there. And then what does it do? It animates public and private spaces, rejuvenates structures and streetscapes, local business viability, and public safety, and this like kumbaya world where everybody has come together and there are these like wonderful communities. I think that folks have a really hard, even folks who do creative placemaking work have a really hard time describing what creative placemaking is because of the loosey-goosiness of that definition. It's frustrating, and it doesn't go nearly far enough to address equity, but there is kind of a genius to it that if you are interested in this intersection or bringing arts and culture in a meaningful way to produce results for the communities that you're working in, that this is like the loosest possible parameters, and you can fit a lot in here. Like, they're not putting a lot of boundaries on what you might try to do with this. And there's kind of, like I said, there's kind of a genius to that. It's given a lot of people a really fertile, wide bed to experiment in. And so I'd like to ground this with an example. I think that will make it more realistic why this is different. We're getting really far away from our public art murals right now. So this is the Irrigate project in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul was expanding a rail line in a neighborhood along a corridor that had a lot of small mom and pop businesses, and the businesses were apoplectic that they were going to use. It was something like 2 years the road was going to be completely ripped up, and they were just like anticipating, we get by on razor thin margins right now. What are we going to do when nobody's driving here and there's all these disincentives to walking around here because it's just a giant construction mess for 2 years while we put in this rail system. And so the strategy that the city, the transit agency, and some foundations hit on was this very kind of tactical urbanism mixed with creative placemaking strategy of intervening by spreading their money as thin as they could to activate the space with events and activity like as many days as they could fill. If they could fill the entire calendar with like little teeny tiny events, they would do that. And so what you have an outdoor Zumba class where they're like, they've choreographed some dances about the pain of living through a construction project. There are murals involved. Some folks got funding for murals. We've got drumline events. We've got other dance and cultural events. And then you've really got this sort of like flash mob energy even. I mean, we're talking like the smallest of small interventions here. And more or less, they kept these businesses thriving through the construction project until the new line went in. Unfortunately, I was thinking as I was putting this slideshow together that I don't really have a super strong follow-up on like, are these businesses still there? How are they handling increased rents from an area that now has better public transit? If that happened, like what is the feeling a few years later about this? I really don't know, but at least in the short term, I know that everybody involved from the community level and the institutional level were pretty excited about how this project worked out. So to put the egghead hat on, one of the big problems with creative placemaking is that fuzziness and loose around the edges aspect that I was describing earlier makes it really difficult to measure. And if you want to spend a bunch of money on this stuff, it would be nice to measure it. It would be nice to know how to replicate successes that happen in one very specific community in another community that has a bunch of different nuanced parameters. There are still no easy answers to these questions. A lot of smart people are dedicating a lot of thought energy to this, and it's an ongoing experiment. So this is really a hub of a lot of that activity. It's an organization called Art Place America, and they have been putting together a series of field scans, understanding how this work is done with a explicit mission of attempting to find measurement systems that work and are that they're confident are replicable. And so that's where Metris and my work with Metris came back in the picture, is that this kind of intimidating looking list of funders, we're all curious about the effect. They had a hunch that in marginalized communities or in communities that are struggling in some way, that arts and culture could be deployed strategically to increase social cohesion in these communities, and then there's some research linking social cohesion to a broad set of health and well-being outcomes, community health and well-being outcomes. And so they tasked us with looking at that, with exploring practice and exploring the literature to see if we could prove this dynamic. And so that's the team. That's Anne in the middle there, and then my friends and coworkers, Rachel and Claudia over there. I've missed those guys. We ended up writing this report called We-Making. And what We-Making does is, well, we ended up with this too complicated by half theory of change. Don't try to read that. It's way too much. But basically the breakdown is, I think, kind of what I described earlier. In struggling communities, targeted arts interventions of a particular sort increase social cohesion, which empowers and organizes communities and leads to better health and well-being outcomes. A lot of problems here, and unfortunately, I think that I'm really proud of the work that we did, but in some ways, I think the research isn't quite here to support this, which speaks to how complicated this theory of change is because we would be able to find pieces that would link social cohesion to a community well-being metric, but wasn't about arts and culture. Or we found one that linked place-based arts and culture strategies to an aspect of social cohesion, but didn't talk about the later outcomes. And so we kind of created this like piecemeal Frankenstein where we would take bits of research over here and sort of be like, oh, if like A leads to B and then someone else said B leads to C, then maybe that works. But the research to support this entire ecosystem just doesn't exist right now. So yeah, no direct linkages, another problem. Some of the research leapfrogs social cohesion, so you'll go straight from arts and cultural interventions to some really cool outcome for a community, and they don't talk about social cohesion at all. So future research is going to need to figure out what's going on there, if social cohesion is the linking point or whether something else is going on and we got it wrong. And then, of course, a predictable disconnect between research, which is really not there, and practice, where a lot of this work is kind of happening intuitively. And the different languages and value disconnects there were really illuminated through this process. The only thing that everyone agrees on is that social cohesion takes a really long time, possibly a generation to foster in a neighborhood that doesn't have any. And so that makes any sort of like measurement future really hard to imagine. How to measure a generational change in a community in a way that also has like control groups, and you can assess the specific effects of art and cultural interventions versus something else. It's a little hazy, but this is the field scan where it's at right now. During that project, I was able to spend a lot of time talking to and working with some really cool communities. So that was kind of a personal outcome that I really enjoyed from this. This is Natchez, Mississippi, is a town that most of its economic activity is around tourism, and specifically tourism around the antebellum South and slavery. And a lot of those tourist dollars go to white organizations. And so this intervention was meant to infuse cash and organization into this community to develop up the tourism industry for folks from the African American community to tell, in this town, to start to have the infrastructure to tell their own stories and to take advantage of all of the economic activity around the telling of their stories in their town. And so social cohesion in this case would be an uplifting of a community that's been left outside of this process. A very different type of community. This is your classic kind of Trump coal country, declining small town, Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. University of Pennsylvania did a study in I want to say 2011 or 2012, where they surveyed all of the small towns below a certain population size in Pennsylvania for their level of social capital and sense of hope about the future, and Tamaqua was dead last. And folks, a couple really cool people in this community got together and started building up a network where they are using events and using, sort of trying to flush the town with activities and opportunities for folks to tell their own story, even if it is an uncomfortable, painful story. This is like also an opioid addiction town, and so there's a lot of pain in this community, and not a lot of avenues for expressing that pain. So they're on the very slow process of just trying to say, like, can we even just see each other from the start before then we try to move towards building up a sense of hope and then what we're actually building towards. University of Pennsylvania went back 5 years later, and they actually measured a statistically significant increase in, I don't remember the specific categories, but it was social capital and hope for the future, or something along those lines. And then finally in East Oakland, there are a bunch of really cool folks working out there in a community to develop a black cultural zone in the neighborhood of East Oakland, where they're facing a lot of displacement pressure, to create both a legally recognized, like literally a zone, an area, that's anchored by a cultural center that also serves, that also provides displacement mitigation or displacement-related services for people who live in the community. So help finding a new apartment, legal aid, that sort of stuff, that it would be tied into this cultural center. So it would be both serving a very specific use for longtime residents of the area. It's not there yet, so it's still a little hazy what that would specifically be, but then also celebrates the heritage of the community as well. So there's some kind of classic tensions that have emerged in creative placemaking, and the big one is the who's who. Who's making the place? Who are they making it for? Are they making it for people who are there now to take advantage of it? Are they making it for new people who are going to come in when they're enticed by how cool it is after you've done your creative placemaking? And that really gets to like a big question that a lot of cities are facing right now. What about places that need some TLC, but they're already made places? They've been made. They don't need to be made. They need help in other ways, or whatever is there needs to be amplified. And so you see some variations on the term thrown around right now. Some popular ones are creative placekeeping, creative place healing for communities that have experienced individual, social, or generational trauma. And then kind of a catch-all, so this guy Ben Stone, who works for Transportation for America, tries to sort of do this course correction mea culpa, where he talks about creative placemaking 2.0 as this, as a kind of it's like the new, shiny, equity-focused creative placemaking. It's the same thing, but highlighting what communities you're working with, why you're working with them, and prioritizing communities that have been marginalized in other ways historically is really the name of the game for nearly everyone you talk to working in this discipline right now, I would say. I think that there's a lag in public perception, perhaps, and I can only speak for like where I stand, but everybody who I speak to who's working here now is very, very invested in all three of these. So I left Pennsylvania, came back here to finish up school, and started working for Go Collaborative with Lynn Osgood, who some of you may know as your qualitative instructor last year. She has been a wonderful mentor and is very wise on all of these topics, and would love to talk to folks if people are interested in this. So we've done work for a variety of different clients. The Cap Metro project earlier was with Lynn. We're doing work right now for foundation communities, Bastrop, Hard, and more work for Art Place too. And one other thing, I'm going to go pretty fast on this, but Lynn is really fantastic about using artist facilitation for community meetings, for charrettes, workshops, different types of activities where art is actually a way at getting at something that's like less left-brained, less in your head and more in your gut and more in your heart. And I think that planning as a discipline sometimes struggles to cross that barrier. And so expanding and exploring and experimenting with how you can use art for facilitation is really important. I think. We did work with foundation communities this week. The goal of this workshop that we did, last week rather, the goal of this workshop we did was to design the entry space for a new foundation communities office. It was a design project, and what we did is we had a clear sense that the designers were not quite understanding the communities that foundation communities serves, their like reason for being. And so we hired an artist and a poet to go and meet with a series of different clients who work for foundation communities to tell their story and to explain what their buy-in to a relationship with foundation communities as an organization is. And then those stories in the design charrette were related by the clients and the artists themselves. And it was really amazing to see, instead of going from this idea of like, should it be like blue carpet or wood floor, it all of a sudden became about like the sense of like stress or anxiety or comfort when you're going into a space as somebody who like doesn't have a lot of experience with institutional spaces or sees them as antagonistic. Like the way that you were able to get out of that like, you know, picking wallpaper side of your brain into something that was like very emotional and very at the level of the people who are actually going to be the users of the space was really powerful. Okay, so the big one. The rest of today, I think I'm going to talk about art and displacement. It's a really complicated subject, and I have no answers, and the only thing that I would just try to underline here is the nuance around this issue, and a lot of people, especially around terms and definitions. It's an area where it's really easy, and there's so much pain going on around displacement, that it's really easy to shoot from your gut and not, and the overlaps between different communities is really complicated, and there's a lot of pain and a lot of people are feeling pinches. Yeah, let's explore that, I guess. So, you know, two potentially contrary hypotheses. Artists are victims of displacement and artists displace. In Austin, both of these are asserted constantly. Are they contradictory? I don't know. Are they both happening? Do artists have anything to do with displacement? I don't know. So I'm going to explore some examples of both of these. Artists as victims of displacement, or artists vulnerable to displacement, and then artists causing the displacing or participating in it. So this is a photo of the Ghost Ship Warehouse in Oakland, which burned down in December 2016. This was run as a DIY venue, and there was a concert going on inside on the second floor. There was one exit. A lot of you probably know the story. The staircase was made of like cardboard or something absurd, and 36 people lost their lives in this fire. This was a community that was adjacent or of a similar type to the communities that I grew up and came through, and so. Yeah, this hit really close to home, and the fallout in the days after this tragedy are still kind of like shape how I think about cultural planning today, or the place of art and communities. So, you know, a huge conversation about health and safety. You know, why hadn't code inspectors shut this place down? Why hadn't the fire marshal shut this place down years ago? And then a lot of places were shut down across the country after this. There was a rash of surprise inspections and like really no leeway for informal cultural spaces across the country. And so a lot of, I would argue, important informal cultural centers were lost because of that. On the other hand, you don't, like, as a council member or a fire marshal or a code department, you don't want another ghost ship fire on your hand. I would also argue, however, that from what I understand, this space was particularly dangerous and ill-managed, and I just want to like pump the brakes a little bit and say that a lot of folks who operate and move in this community nobody wants something like this to happen. Like, it's an absurd statement. And I have known a lot of spaces that are extremely vigilant about fire and safety code on their own, whether or not they're like zoned for use or something. And so, so this place was called Rhinoceropolis in Denver, Colorado. This was my DIY space growing up. These guys' space too. And the day after the ghost ship fire, they were evicted. They had been in the space for 13 years. They had regular inspections from fire and code, and whatever bureaucratic direction they got the day after the axe was dropped, and they're gone. Because of some really impressive community organizing, happy to report that 2 years later, as of a month or two ago, they're back open now with the blessing of the city as a formal venue. But it was a painful exercise for the community, where this space was a magnet for some fringy types. So this conversation then blossomed into, we know that we're not technically legal. We're in the gray area of legality about whether we're up to code or whether we're zoned for the activities that we're doing here in spaces like this across the country. And yet we're providing something, like we're providing some direct positive impact for the people who use these spaces, not just in terms of like entertainment or whatever, but also in terms of safe places and community for LGBTQ youth. There's conflicting claims about the relationship between this community and communities of color or low-income communities. There tends to be a simmering conversation about DIY communities as sort of like slumming white rich kids, and that's definitely present there, but other communities are represented here as well. And it's really, I think that this is my big takeaway when we talk about like what is an artist or who are we talking about when we talk about these communities, is they don't work like a demographic community. The people who use these spaces, and I'm not talking about your like classic fancy gentrification gallery, I'm talking about your like deep, slummy, no shower spaces. They tend to be catch-alls for a lot of different types of people. The Seattle Arts Commission got that. This is a really interesting document, if you can find it. They sent a letter to Mayor Ed Murray at the time, basically imploring him not to do the same thing that was happening around the country of shutting down and displacing DIY spaces. And their arguments were around these spaces as these sort of safety nets for a lot of different types of marginalized youth and marginalized people. I go back and forth on it. I think that sometimes that argument is overstated. I think sometimes it's not in the conversation enough. And this letter, it's 2 years old now, it sticks with me. I still don't know if it's true or not. And so it's just this inflection point that I go back to really often. This group we worked with, the New York City Arts Coalition, they were one of the groups responsible for New York's Nightmare. They are an interesting group of people, but I thought they said it really elegantly. Culture is born in small, diverse spaces, thus we should protect them. I did work with my local space, Museum of Human Achievement. We got in contact right after the ghost ship fire. They also had some surprise enforcement right afterwards. Luckily, they're one of those vigilant spaces that I was talking about, and they didn't experience too much pain. But this got a conversation rolling with us on just how to navigate, like this ongoing conversation that the guy who runs the space and I have been having over the course of 2 years on how to articulate the value to the community, how to navigate the relationship between rising rents for spaces like this and rising rents for residents, especially residents with historic ties to these communities. And there's no easy answers, but we are trying to do the work volunteer style for just putting together a series of best practices that we think can sort of walk that tightrope here. So a year ago, we produced a series of recommendations that just sort of low-key behind the scenes. We've been seeding around to different departments in the city of Austin and different key players in the cultural community. We have revised these a lot since this point, and there's nothing public to report yet, but there's a lot of activity going on with this right now, and we feel pretty hopeful that the regulatory environment around cultural space is going to see some positive revisions in the near future. If anyone's interested in getting involved with this, we always need more hands. And so back to Oakland, The Guardian released an article a lot about this space about a season or two ago, and this kind of gets at that idea of like, who is an artist? What is an artist doing? What do we mean when we think about or when we conceptualize artists? The Elena Museum is a semi-formal space in Oakland that supports its main activities are around art that is Afrofuturist and supporting the past and future heritage of the Oakland African American community. They lost their lease right around the time of this article, and their landlord specifically cited the ghost ship fire as why he would no longer support cultural space. And so in this, I sort of like use all of this wind up to say that when we sort of like, when we just have a sense in our mind of like what an artist or what an art space is and their effect on changing neighborhoods, I just want to put it in the air that there's a lot of nuance going on and a lot of different overlapping communities that all take value here. Whiter, richer people moving into neighborhoods didn't invent art. So again, yeah, who are artists? There's many answers to this. And then who are gentrifiers? When we worked on the Uprooted report last year, the definition that we used was not a gentrifier, but rather neighborhoods that are gentrifying fit some or all of these criteria. The population becomes whiter over time, becomes wealthier over time, more people not from within the neighborhood move into it, more educated populations move into that neighborhood. And so it gets really hard when you're talking about pointing a finger at somebody because maybe you fit all four of these categories. What if you fit two of those categories? Are you a gentrifier? I don't know. And I think that this is language and syntax that, regardless of the outcome, I would love to see incorporated into the conversation in the community in Austin right now. So there's a lot of, oh yeah, I hope nobody is offended by bad words. There's a lot of leftist activist action energy right now around anti-arts, it's anti-arts activity saying that art leads to gentrification or that art is, white art is gentrification. Ground zero for this was in the Boyle Heights neighborhood in LA. The organization Defend Boyle Heights started doing gallery protests, disrupting gallery openings, and they've gotten a lot of activity and a lot of press around that. Some individual galleries have moved out of Boyle Heights. Is that going to stop displacement in Boyle Heights? I don't know. Chinatown Art Brigade in New York City, their big strategy is projecting anti-displacement messaging on different buildings in Chinatown. And this is going on in Austin right now. Like, this is the conversation in this city right now. This was a Austin Chronicle article that came out yesterday. Just about the Riverside Arts District partially and the Presidium development that's going in there. So you see this common story over the course of the last few years of low-income, no-income, nonprofit, mission-driven art spaces that are losing space in Austin and needing a place to go. And in comes Presidium Group, who owns this bunch of land over here just east of Pleasant Valley. This is where the ballpark apartments are right now, which are a generally low-income apartment complex. They're a series of apartment complexes with a mixture of students and low-income families. And Presidium Group is going to make like a domain 2.0 here. They have the land holding. They're working through permitting right now. And they offered the Austin Creative Alliance a deal they can't refuse. Basically, they said, while we're constructing this thing for 3 years, we're going to put up a semi-permanent artist village, and we're going to subsidize the rents of a bunch of different cultural spaces of your choosing to come in, and it's like a win-win, right? Like artist spaces are losing space. This space is going to go unused for a number of years. Let's plug the artists in there. It'll be great. So this is a rendering of the proposed artist village. On the ground, that doesn't feel so good for everybody living in those apartment complexes. So the Austin-fashioned version of Defend Boyle Heights is called Defend Our Hoods. It's a militant, radical, Marxist, Maoist group who's been extremely vigilant about protesting every activity related to this potential arts district, which I haven't been down there recently, but I believe that it's not functioning right now because of all of this activity and controversy. And like literally this weekend, this is the Austin Creative Alliance, the quasi-city organization that has organized this entire deal with Presidium Group, were tagged. You can't say that it was Defend Our Hoods, but it appears to be folks who are aligned value-wise with Defend Our Hoods. And it says art washers, sellouts fuck off, and they broke their windows. So I don't know. I really don't know if I have a statement on what to do with that. In my opinion, I think ACA, Austin Creative Alliance, kind of stepped in it. Like they should have seen the context of the neighborhood that they were moving into. They're sort of paying the price by being the most visible thing that you can lash out to with this big monolithic development, which is the real problem here. It doesn't get at any of the underlying issues throwing bricks through these windows, but it is an extremely direct expression of the pain that these communities are feeling. That's kind of where I want to leave that. For planners and for artists, both, I think it's important to remember that art's not a panacea, and furthermore that art is a tool, and it's kind of one of those things like use a screwdriver for what a screwdriver's for. Don't, have a good understanding of when this is going to be appropriate to use in a community and when it's not going to be appropriate, when the situation on the ground makes it so this isn't going to work. As we've seen through this, art can amplify a lot of great energy and relationship building and community building in communities, in cities, and neighborhoods. And it can also amplify frustration and anger and fear and some of our most antagonistic impulses. And so again, just context sensitivity and I think that this is really, I think planners generally have a sense of context sensitivity. I hope that in the cultural planning context, this lecture has sort of shined a little on that. I think artists more could be open a lot more to understanding context sensitivity. We're like narcissistic little unicorns sometimes and want to just do our art wherever we can make it. I think that art communities as a whole could benefit incredibly from having a greater sense of how they fit into the texture of the places that they are. And so to not end on a total downer, the last two slides are just an organization that's somewhat local that I think is doing exactly that. Las Imaginistas in Brownsville, Texas is using arts-based workshopping, arts-based activities and interventions at a broad scale. Like it seems like they've got 3 activities a week, building towards developing relationships and capacities and knowledge and networks for low-income immigrant communities along the border in Brownsville. So they use movement workshops. They use kind of like James Rojas style place-it workshops where they envision what like a more equitable or more empowered future community like theirs would be. And then there's a follow-through on this. They're also developing a policy building network here. So trying to figure out through activities like this emergently what the needs of these communities are in terms of economic opportunity, educational opportunity, even just like training on how to go down to City Hall and talk to a city official or a council member. Yeah, and I think they're doing really incredible work and are an organization worth looking into. And that's where I want to leave it for today. Thank you.
Okay, terrific talk, really. Do we have questions? Yeah.
I don't know what your personal medium is for art, but it's obvious that you're an artist as well. And I wanted to ask if that helps you when you're trying to be context sensitive. Do you how do you maintain your sensitivity, and is your artwork integral in that balance?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, since I've been in school for the last 2 years, I'm not much of an artist right now. And a lot of my energy in the arts community, locally and just professionally, is around this sort of more policy end. And I am excited and enthusiastic to figure out what the answer to your question is. Unfortunately, I haven't had a lot of opportunity or time in the last 2 years to explore that. Some of the work that we were doing, we did a big performance and event series in the spring before I went back to school, me and a group of artists, that was around the issue more of like gender and masculinity and toxic masculinity, which is like kind of a big buzzword now, I guess. We tried to expand beyond the multimedia performances that we were doing themselves into community groups and facilitating conversations around these topics that were open and sort of deployed in a lot of different types of ways. So there were different sort of like remixes of activities and repackagings that were meant to sort of plant these conversations in different ways and with different types of people who would show up to different activities.
Is there a conversation in creative placemaking around like the combination of housing as an investment in the arts and community preference policy, like a place like Austin where artists can no longer afford to live, but also like historically marginalized communities here can no longer afford to live? How do you prioritize like art who lives in our very limited, affordable housing?
Yeah, well, I think that that conversation gets, again, very tricky definitionally. I went to a dialogue or a panel at the Carver Museum in East Austin a couple weeks ago, where the panel was made up entirely of artists of color who saw absolutely no difference in the displacement pressure that they were feeling as artists and the displacement pressure that they were feeling as residents. It's hard to explain in a PowerPoint presentation-y setting like this, but you really do get a sense on the ground sometimes that it is really personal, and there's not really a clear definitional boundary between the pressure that's felt by one group or another group, because there's no clear boundary between those groups. Now, obviously, there are people who don't belong, that are not from these communities, who are not demographically representative of anything that was in these communities before, and that's a conversation, but what makes it so tricky is that it's this gradient. There's no hard markers, and anytime you try to draw a line, someone's like, hey, you put me on the wrong side of the line, and it really, unfortunately, kind of like gets the conversation stuck in the mud a little bit. I really do think that we're at an inflection moment for that conversation, where there's a lot of energy around having it, and you can feel a lot of need for better language to describe the experiences that are being felt on the ground right now.
How much of the literature that y'all went through like this summer and since then touches on the intersections with historic preservation? Because it seems like a lot of the informal spaces that you highlighted here are like old warehouses, or that one in Brownsville just looked like an abandoned two-story like office building or something. Mm-hmm. It seems like there is some connection in this place-keeping effort between like organic cultural expression and like maintaining spaces that allow it?
Yeah. Yeah, so to answer the first part of that question, the literature we looked at this summer wasn't necessarily around physical space as much. It was about building up communities. And it wasn't necessarily about preserving cultural spaces at all. But I think that is one of the tools, right? And I think that's actually, that tool speaks to, it's, I think, used very frequently in Austin to preserve spaces for a variety of different types of cultural communities. We worked on a project, I was just at the very far periphery of it, but there was an old Latino radio DJ from the 40s or 50s who was like a notable popular DJ from that time, who had a house over off of 4th and Kamal, and a developer wanted to develop that land, and they stopped it with it was stopped temporarily because they wanted to preserve that house as like a historic cultural site. The very weird solution that they came up with is that my friend Chris Harris found a woman living in the Blackland neighborhood whose house burned down, and she was like 80 years old and had no money to develop another house and nowhere to go. And so they actually moved this house from 4th and Kamal. It was deemed not historic enough to need to stay where it was, but historic enough that the building needed to be maintained. And then the developer paid for it to be trucked in the middle of the night over to Blackland. And now it's this like low-income lady who's been living in Blackland her entire life now has like a new house that's historically designated, and hey.
So I know that the city of Austin has done a little bit of research in response to the issues within the city. Something that I know a lot of nonprofit leaders, the city have been involved with, like the release from Valley Austin. I was wondering if some of the research has been done in that area to come out with three separate reports and information about the issue within the city. Has that been useful at all in your understanding and preparation of the city?
I, along with Alice here, and I think we're the only two in the room who worked on it, but we worked on one of the reports, the Uprooted report that came out of this department. And that one was more focused on residential displacement. The anti-displacement task force recommendations have a culture, art, and small business section at the end. I still feel like that conversation is emergent, and how to connect or how to deal with, excuse me, residential displacement, which I have no argument that is above and beyond the more important conversation to be having. That's where a lot of the energy, that's where the Uprooted report energy was at, and that's where most of the energy in the anti-displacement task force recommendations were. There was a promising two-page almost addendum on cultural preservation at the end of that report. It feels preliminary to me, and so my takeaway with that is, yes, it's helpful, and it's important to know who's having these conversations, in what areas the conversation is being had, and in which way in the different areas. And it's useful, again, when like we're trying to organize around a recommendation, to be able to point to someone else's report and say like, oh, hey, they're thinking about that too. But I think that the report stops short of trying to reconcile those two buckets. And I don't think it should have. I don't think it was scoped to. But that conversation is still there to be had.
Any other questions? That's definitely. So, I mean, this real sort of problematic or narrative about, artists move into a low-income community because they can afford the space and they need the space. They then maybe have stronger voice with city services to improve the services. That sort of prepares the ground for, a more kind of dramatic gentrification transformation process. That narrative's been around for decades and decades and decades. I was on the Lower East Side of New York, and the 80s, and that was, and it's a correlation versus causation effect. It's always, sort of, as you say, it is more complex than it seems on the surface, but that's people's perception. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
And that's a perception, in lots of cities where you see this process of artistic spaces or people moving in to get affordable space because they're artists, then 5 years later the neighborhood's really transforming pretty dramatically. And at the same time, in these communities, there were oftentimes robust and very interesting, kind of indigenous, if you were, artistic and cultural activity going on, but wasn't recognized, particularly by the cities or public authorities that might support art. So, I'm just trying to think of a way to think through that narrative and communicate more clearly so that, there might be some at least pragmatic solutions. Like, okay, if you're an artist who live in this community longer term, you're going to get preference for some city support or some housing support or whatever. Do you see, are there any practices out there or kind of initiatives out there somewhere around the country that take that on more kind of specifically?
I think that arts departments in cities overall are fairly, I think that they're like Alana focused, right? Like they use like an Alana lens. So it's all about if they've got a grant or a program, it's like we need to attempt within whatever parameters to distribute these funds in a way that's representative of the diversity of communities that live in our city, or that weight towards communities that that maybe have a longer history or don't have as much of a voice for organizing and like being in the face of people who work in these departments. I think that I don't know, this probably is going off on a little tangent away from your core question, but city departments who deal with arts and culture have sort of two tasks that usually aren't very clearly defined. One is supporting the arts sector, whatever that means, and I think that your question is at how do you do that in a way that then amplifies and recognizes what maybe wasn't recognized as art by cities 50 years ago or 5 years ago. And then the other question is like everything that we talked about with like creative placemaking here and arts and cultural interventions is less about supporting the arts economy, and it's more about access to art as a part of like being a total person or building up a civic structure. And the same departments that are tasked with supporting the arts economy are also tasked with that other thing that may overlap in some ways, but may be like moving in the different direction in other ways sometimes. So, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Thanks, Dr.
Thanks, Al.